Welcome to the MBN Solutions Boss and Data podcast. This episode, our topic is Make Data Simple Again. The last 20 years have witnessed an incredible growth in the requirement for data-driven decisioning within many aspects of society, from the commercial world through governmental and civil service decision-making to the services that we all rely upon as citizens. Reliance on fact, science and predictability has replaced HiPPO decision-making, gut instinct and guesswork, and now that the genie is out of the bottle, there's no going back. However, is the industry overcomplicated, accidentally or deliberately? Are the companies that sell products and solutions in the data sector muddying the waters for their own benefit? Joining me today to discuss the topic in more detail is a data leader who believes passionately that sometimes simple solutions can be both effective and adequate. He's the founder of Head for Data, a consultancy helping businesses across Scotland and beyond to get their heads around data. He previously co-founded the data science function within Agreco before moving on to be Director of Data Science at a PropTech SaaS startup, where his innovative solutions resulted in 4 patents being awarded. Welcome to the show, Colin Parry. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thanks. Thank you for having me.
Absolute honour and a pleasure, sir. We have known each other for a number of years now, and to collaborate together in this manner makes my heart sing on this Friday morning, dude.
Thank you very much. Yeah, me too. I'm very happy to be here, and hopefully we can talk some sense.
I may be stretching it slightly, fella. Yeah, but let's see. As I've mentioned, Colin, you and I have known each other for a very long time now, but for the benefit of the audience, can you tell us your story? Where do you come from? What's been your journey in data? Where are you now? All that kind of good stuff.
Sure. So, like a lot of people, I kind of fell into this accidentally. It wasn't something that I planned because, when I was at university, there was no data science specific degrees. So I came from a physics background originally, and I was very interested in renewables and environmental modelling and things like that. So I went to do a master's in that, went to work for a couple of renewables companies where I got involved in data analysis, data warehousing. Then I joined Agreco, was there for 3 years, helped start their data science function, and then I joined a PropTech company where I was developing the sort of other side of the data world. So I wasn't an internal support function, but a product function. Yep. And they are, helped them build a data science capability and a product for reducing carbon in commercial buildings. And then more latterly, obviously now I'm working on my own. Mm-hmm. So I'm just helping clients with all aspects of data. And that transition really going from a very cutting edge data science function back to helping a wider variety of businesses really sparked this kind of conversation, I think, and it just reiterates a lot of the points that we're going to talk about today.
Right, grand. And we've obviously been debating this particular topic backwards and forwards over the last few weeks. You believe, unless I've misunderstood you, that there's often a lack of simplicity within solution design in the data sector. Is that correct?
It is. And the angle I want to start from here is before we go into a lot of the discussions, because I don't want to sound like I'm being dismissive of how difficult technical projects are, right? So that's the first thing I want to acknowledge is there's no, this is not easy to do, right? So that's the starting point. But what doesn't help a lot is outside of people who do this day to day, the general lack of STEM comprehension in the wider public, and including inside many businesses, is very low, right? And that's something that we all need to acknowledge and we need to be aware of. So it relies on, communicating complex things between technical people who really understand what's going on in general to people who often don't, and it's that communication piece that can sometimes fail. And if you compare it to buying a product or service that we all know, so for example, if you were to go out and purchase a car, right, you can evaluate what you need, how many doors you want, what kind of performance you need, etc., because we all understand that. When businesses are trying to evaluate technical things, they don't always understand how to evaluate that. And that's, as a data person, you need to be able to do that. Now, I am not saying data people deliberately make things complicated, but it's easy to get carried away with, okay, let's get this company ready for big data. But they're a, 4-man accountancy firm with 10,000 rows of data. They're never going to need that, Mm-hmm. And it's not so much that tech people are out to pull the wool over businesses' eyes. I just sometimes feel we just get a little bit too carried away too quickly. And, we'll come to this later as well, but there's a little bit of ego as well, where people want to work with technologies and tools that are the cutting edge. Doing the simple stuff is mundane.
I think, and there's 2 points I'd like to explore on the back of that response, if it's all right with you. And I think the first one is, and I didn't really understand why there was such a push from data professionals on data literacy. I understand now.
Yeah.
That if an organisation has a certain level of data literacy, then the conversations you're talking about can take place. But if the gap between the technical specialist and the business itself is huge, it leads to that problem that you've just mentioned there. Sorry, I'll come back to the other point in a bit. I think one of the things from my perspective is, and I think moving on to the next question, we're in a difficult time economically at the moment. What does this overcomplication mean in terms of organisational spends?
So I think there's kind of two aspects of that, right? So I'd split that in question into two, which is, where are organisations misspending on software and technical products or even hardware, and where are they misspending on people? Right, so they're the kind of two areas that I would split that into. On the software side, it's a large part of that is to do with, how do you evaluate a product for your needs? And again, going back to what I said earlier, you need to be able to understand what is it you're trying to achieve with this product. And I think what we've seen over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, and it's only accelerating more and more over time, is moving away from desktop products, from on-prem servers into cloud, into SaaS products. And so what that does is it lowers the barrier to entry, which is great, but sometimes it can tie you in. If you put all your data on one of these platforms, how do you get it out? And touching up specifically on our topic of keeping things simple, sometimes evaluating what that product can do is hard. And because the products are changing faster, because they're able to release these products, daily or weekly, rather than having to go through, 2 updates a year release cycles, that can be both good and bad. It can add new features, but it can also break things, complicate things. And we've seen that a lot with things recently. You only have to look at the last, let's say, 2-3 months with ChatGPT, some of the issues that they've had where they've made bad releases, things have went wrong. Obviously, Google Gemini being another example. And, other products that do even simpler things than that, it's hard to evaluate what you need. I think as well that products are sometimes start off with a specific niche, but then they grow arms and legs because they want to capture more and more of the market, and then they do some things really well and sometimes they do things really poorly. So I think that's one area where there's just a lot of complexity, and really sorting out what's a good product, what's not a good product, being able to evaluate that is a difficult skill, and I think we're not always getting that correct. I think something that I know you've been a big proponent of, and other people in the recruitment world, is getting the right type of people. So we've all seen, and we all know the people who've been doing this for a while, that sometimes businesses have been hiring too specialist people, like, for example, data scientists, without having really any data, without having really any data structure. And one of the things I've seen, and you'll be able to talk much more about this than me, is that now we're seeing a huge demand for data engineers. And I think that's just because people have realised, wait a minute, we can't run before we can walk. you know. And if we don't have any kind of foundational data platform in place, there's no way we can get further value, or it's much harder to get value out of it, you know. And I've seen that recently. I've been working with a client who is doing a data science project, but a large part of it's me being cleaning up their data for them just to get it ready for that.
Yeah, and I think on that particular point, firstly, we noticed it, and I think everybody in the industry noticed it, that there was an immediate attraction towards the sexier sides of the role, the job, the function. You know, everybody wanted to go and build models and do ML, but then we started hearing back from quite a lot of people who'd gone in perhaps at foundation level, and then the feedback was that they spent the first 12, 18 months of the job not doing any of that stuff, but doing a lot of fundamental, more mundane stuff, until it was realised that that's what you have to do first before you can do the sexy stuff, you know. So it's just part and parcel of. And I remember seeing an amazing presentation, and I'm trying to remember the name of the lady that gave the presentation, but the pie chart on the wall was a presentation at a university. And I think it was Audrey Letevi, I think it was, that gave the presentation. And she had a pie chart, and it said, and if it wasn't you, Audrey, I do apologise, but it was a great presentation, and the pie chart in the middle was 80%, 20%. And it said, this is your first 2 years as a data scientist, 80% crap stuff, 20% good stuff. Get used to it, that's what it's going to look like. But I feel that there's been a little bit of and I know we go on to talk about it in terms of the expectations in early careers. I think there's been a little bit of a hype around that. But the point I wanted to go back, something that you mentioned earlier on there, and I'm trying to remember the actual phrase for this, but it's the phrase that's used. You've bought a tool or a platform or a product, you're using it for a set period of time, and then you want to try something else. But that can be very, very difficult. In my line of work, we experience it because the mothership for a lot of what we do is a CRM system. And moving or migrating from one CRM system to another CRM system can be a onerous task, because no CRM system that you're paying a license fee to wants to let go. Just a complete supplementary off the wall question here. Do you think something like an open banking model would help, where it was much easier to move from vendor to vendor or from tech to tech, that everybody had to sign up to this, and it said, when it comes to the end, you're going to make things as smooth and easy as possible. You're going to give your customer as much help as possible to move from where you are to where they want to go. Do you think that would help things?
I mean, I think in theory, yes. I think that's would be a model that would certainly help. And it's something I always advise businesses I work with is, before you sign up to a SaaS solution, think about, if you have a falling out, or if they increase their prices and you're not willing to pay it, what are you going to do? You need a plan. Because before you sign up, make sure that that's possible. You know, there is a software product that I've seen recently where they charge you a large amount of money to remove the data out, you know, and it's just part of the way that they run the business. Now, one of the things I was reading quite very recently was the EU are fighting with some of the big tech giants, so your Microsoft, Amazons and Googles, about cloud portability. Right. So this is where they were charging what the EU felt was unreasonable egress fees to get data out of systems, and now they're waiving them. Right, it's still ongoing. Right. So, you know, this, depending on when you listen to this may be outdated information. But fundamentally, I think it's going to take regulation in order to do that. And I think the SaaS products that people are now using, we're still at quite an early stage. You know, you're only talking 5 to maybe 10 years of really where everyone's now using SaaS products, you know. And I don't know that we've really understood that. And I mean, bringing it back to simplicity again, having that ability to move would simplify things, because then you have the freedom of choice.
Yep.
As you say, no SaaS company wants you to take your data out of there and move it somewhere else. But obviously things like GDPR your GDPR regulation has enabled ordinary consumers to do that, you know, to be able to get access to their data in a portable format. Expanding that, again, to answer your question, I think would add a lot of value for businesses and simplify the market. And it would force software providers to be honest, be fair, because the customers would be would have the ability to move.
Okay, yeah. Going back to the economics and is it correlation, cause and effect? I'm not sure. Let's explore it. Excuse me. Do you think we are seeing a tangible impact of overspend and waste in the data sector with the amount of data professionals and data leaders currently looking for new roles?
I think yes, and I think again we talked earlier there about the spend being directed towards products and people, and I think in this particular case, there's been a lot of hype recently in the last 10 years, and we'll talk a bit more about hype in some of the later questions, but we've seen various hype cycles with data warehousing with now the
CRM was the one I first remember, then it was data warehousing, then it was cloud, then it was SaaS, then it was data science.
and then now it's LLMs, and all of these things, and I don't want this conversation to be negative, right? The data sector has done a lot of good for businesses, a lot of good for the public, but we've got to acknowledge that where it is today, we could do things better, and we all have to, as data people, try and make the industry better, have a better reputation. And I don't think it has a terrible reputation, but I think where businesses have made mistakes is they've followed hype cycles expecting instant results.
Right.
And again, the expectation mismatch between what data people are going in to see. Well, you want to go in and build a machine learning model, but you don't have any data in a format that we can actually use. So how do we get there? Now we've got to go on a journey before we can even start that. And I think some of the hiring's been wrong, and a lot of businesses have overhired. And I think we don't talk enough about the ROI, the return on investment of every single decision that we have to make, because as we all know, it's not a cheap hobby, right? The people that do this command good salaries, rightly so, because they're technical people, but getting ROI it already puts a barrier up to getting it, because if you're paying a 6-figure salary to bring in someone, you expect them to be returning at least 6 figures of value. And I think what data people need to remember is that, especially if you are an internal support function, so if you're not the product, if you're in a data role where you're in an organisation like a bank or an energy firm or something where you don't make money directly, how do you justify you being there? And I think that's not a passive thing, that's an active thing. And again, going back to keeping it simple, it's how do you communicate the value in a way that non-technical people understand? And I actually posted about this recently on LinkedIn, that it's really easy when you're in this world to overestimate how much other people care about tech, and that's something that I think we also get a bit carried away with. Everybody just assumes that, well, why would you not want to get involved in this? And the reality is, unless it's directly making you money, it's a distraction, right? So I think it's something that we always need to remember. And I think that ability of being able to sell what you're doing, even though you're doing a good job, it's not self-evident always. Sometimes you've got to remind people, look, I'm here and I'm doing this, and look at the value that we've done as a team or individually. And I think that's something that we often overlook.
Very good point, and it takes us back to a previous episode where I discussed with Adam Schrocker the importance of internal branding and being able to articulate the benefits of the data team, the data leader, the data function to internal customers and clients, because if they didn't appreciate the value that you were bringing, it could lead to a problem. Also, one of the things that you mentioned earlier on there when you spoke about that lack of data engineering talent, acutely felt perhaps 2 years ago, when we both in Scotland and in wider UK experienced what could best be described as crazy inflation on data engineering salaries, because, and having been involved in dialogues almost 10 years ago as universities in Scotland in particular geared up to offer courses everybody had data scientist sexiest career of the 21st century in their heads. So of the 20 courses that were offered, 16 were for data scientists. Lo and behold, 7-8 years down the line, we realise we've not got enough data engineers, and any data engineer suddenly finds themselves getting offered loony money for roles. The problem was that, in conjunction with, I think there had been a bit more of a scrutiny placed upon data investment and whether or not organisational investment had returned your ROI point. I think it just led to quite a large reconciliation or reckoning over the course of the last 12 months, as we've seen that change, where we've seen salaries start to equalise out, and we've seen, unfortunately, quite a number of data leaders looking for new roles where the investment has perhaps not been justified.
And I think that is really about, being able to keep it simple. That's moving into domains where, you're trying to get value from data science before you have a data foundation, And I think, again, it goes back to that, if I told you, Rob, I'm going to build a really fancy house, right, but I haven't bothered with any civils work, you would know right away. Anybody with common sense could tell you that's never going to work. And to go back to the first question you asked me, that's where the lack of that data literacy bites businesses, in the backside. Because if you can't identify that and realise that, and as a data professional, again, if you're out of work and you're a data scientist, if you get offered a role, even if you think, well, maybe there's a big road to go on, it's hard to say no to that if you're sitting unemployed. So I think it's unfair to push that back to the data people. But the business not being able to identify that because the people hiring don't understand what they're, the kind of role that they need. That's what hurts it, and that's where the simplicity falls apart.
I think just going back to the wee synopsis at the beginning, where I mentioned that replacing HiPPO decision making and gut instinct now with this scientific predictable methodology, if you like, the ubiquitousness, is that the word, of data-driven decisioning throughout organisations now. Do you feel that leaders, C-suite leaders of any organisation, whether it's a company that makes gardening products or an airline or in the defence industry or retail, regardless of what sector they operate in, do you feel that C-suite leaders should be mandated to improve data literacy, firstly within the boardroom and then secondly throughout the organisation?
I mean, I think any business would benefit from increasing your data literacy at board level and across your organisation. I believe that implicitly. Whether that should be mandated or not is maybe a different question. I think, for me, if you really have a good understanding of data, you will make better decisions in general. Not always. I mean, obviously data can be manipulated, data can be misrepresented, there can be mistakes, but you've got to look at the trends and the averages. And in general, I believe that businesses that use data effectively are going to have better outcomes than businesses that don't. And I think that, that's where, if you have a good understanding of that, and it's difficult, and it's something I talk about on LinkedIn this week, which is about being an influencer, right? We've turned that word into something negative, right? But it actually has other meanings too. And as a data professional and as a data leader, and I think that's where some data leaders have maybe struggled to show their value, is if you're unable to influence people, particularly C-suite people, that this is why you shouldn't do this. And it can be difficult, because if you're running a successful business and you're making money and you're the non-data person, it's hard to, when someone comes in and says, do you know that you could do these things better? And if you've been running that business for 30 years or whatever, and it's hard to look at that and say, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. But being open-minded to these kind of changes will benefit you in the long run.
Okay, to switch focus just for a second, you and I also discussed security implications of over-engineered and overcomplicated solutions. Could you expand on that just a little bit?
Sure. I think it's something that we've seen a lot. There's been a lot of news stories recently about breaches and security incidents that have happened with pretty big companies. You've had some of the credit reference agencies, LinkedIn, some of the big tech companies that really should know better, right? And then you look at things like, well, how do you reduce your risk? Well, one of the things is, if you didn't have any computers, there wouldn't be a security risk, right? But clearly that's a nonsensical way of approaching it. So you need to think about what's the fewest number of components you need to build a solution. And then the fewer components you have, the smaller the surface area of attack is for a given bad agent, right? If you have multi-cloud, then you've got 3 clouds or whatever to secure rather than 1. If you have lots of tools and SaaS vendors, you've got more things you need to think about and risk and all that kind of stuff. So that's where I think the simplicity of designing a solution that doesn't need lots of components will just keep things more secure by default. Mm-hmm. I think also evaluating, SaaS providers, their history, how they take security seriously. If they don't have, I'm still amazed of how many websites, I was doing car insurance this week, and the car insurance providers still don't have MFA, right. Don't have multi-factor authentication. So I'm logging in with an email and password. There's no email to your email with a code or text
code to your phone.
Right. And these are simple systems. And we assume that progress is linear. And once a few companies have done these things, well, it's done, it's obvious, but it's still not. There's still a lot of, design like this that could be done better. And I think moving to the cloud, that step change has been the best and worst thing that's ever happened. The barrier to entry is low, but the risk of misconfiguring something is really high. Right. I mean, the Panama Papers were only released because somebody had been putting stuff in an Azure storage account and they'd made it public. Somebody got wind of that, accessed it, and got a lot of the information. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things like that. And I think being able, again, going back to the influencer piece, being able to articulate why security is important. Everybody groans in an office when you tell them, lock your laptop when you get up. It's the equivalent of wash your hands and brush your teeth. Yeah. But we all know that if you don't wash your hands and you don't brush your teeth, in the long run, it's bad news. And you need that. I think the intangibility of tech makes it difficult to, explain to people why it's important, because it's just sort of in the ether. It's harder to sort of touch and feel it.
Back to data literacy again. If the data literacy was higher, then they would go, no, hold on a minute, that's a really good point. Whereas at the moment, as you say, it's a little bit ethereal. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, I just and a shout out here to Ian Davey, if he ever listens to this episode, who brought it to my attention. I was chairing a panel at the last Digit, which was all about cybersecurity and data, and one of the points that Ian made was, and he'd read it in a piece of research, which was often the cost of implementing the necessary safety measures, right, is a lot more than any potential ICO fine. Mm. So a lot of organisations have thought, well, why bother? And I think it's reflected in that.
Yeah, and I think, however, what I would say to that is reputation matters too. Yeah, and there's a lot of indirect costs to having a security breach. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of public sector contracts now where if you or even bigger organisations. I mean, I remember in the SaaS company I worked in, we'd get 500 security questionnaires. Right. From, because we're supplying a SaaS product into a big organisation. They want to know, have you had any breaches? Do you take this sort of stuff seriously? And so these could sink your business if you don't take it seriously.
Fair point. Moving back then to that relationship between the data leader and the board level, if you like, or that C-suite. And bullshit baffles brains. And in this case, business brains. Has the widening gap between general data literacy, what business leaders understand, and what data leaders do, has that worsened the situation? And I'm thinking here of the complexity of the tools. I'm thinking here about that hype cycle. data leaders now have got it's so much more a complicated landscape. Is the gap just huge? It's just made things so much worse.
I think the gap between those sort of two groups is a bit of an issue, but I think one of the things that maybe is sometimes overlooked, and I'll give first-hand experience of this, is that a lot of tools have big marketing budgets, and we'll come on to the economics in one of the later questions. But if a tool is overselling what it can do, and they're willing to, butter people up the right way, that can sell something without even really considering a lot of these technical questions. I had first-hand experience of a supplier of a SaaS tool who sent two people up from London up to Glasgow to meet with myself and my boss, take us for dinner, spent a fortune on dinner. They only came up for this one meeting, flew up at 4:00, had dinner, went home the next day, just to get us to sign on the dotted line for this product. And that can be persuasive as well, especially these companies that have big money budgets to spend. Because as we all know, relationships are everything. And if they're willing to spend that kind of money, that does make it difficult, because if you're a C-suite executive and you feel like, well, these guys are taking me for dinner, I kind of trust them, they're promising me X, Y, and Z, and then you've got your technical specialist in your ear saying, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Which direction do you go in? And that is, to your point about bullshit baffles brains, that can be a hard thing to untangle. I think overselling of capability is, rife within the industry as well, where products are promising the world and they can't really do things. And, there's a product I'm working with for a client which has two pieces of software that should talk to each other, but they don't. And they're promising they will, and it's been taking forever. And this company bought it on the basis that this integration would take place, and it still hasn't happened yet, Right. So that's been oversold. And unfortunately, people have bought it on that basis, and now they're feeling a bit let down.
I was out for lunch this week with a data leader who showed me the classic vendor tool map. The thing that shows you all the different vendor providers in all the different areas. And I remember 20 years ago, you could have written it on an A4 bit of paper. You'd have divided it would be 3 columns. This is an analytics thing. This is a development or now engineering thing, and this is some kind of an in the middle sciencey thing. And you would have had 20 vendors in each column, and that would have been you. And now you've got 2,000 vendors. Absolutely. And so much more myriad, different divisions of, is it data ops, is it ML ops, is it, everything's became massively complicated. And from my perspective, as an observer, a participant in some respects, but as an observer, I'm thinking, if I'm sitting on a board and I've got, as you say, that on one side I've got vendors telling me that their thing's the next best thing and it's going to change the world and you've got to be on this train and don't get left behind. And then I've got my technical people who are trying their best to evaluate maybe 100 products. It must be increasingly impossible to try and get it right. And every month there's another new 100 products entering onto the market in some respects, in different ways. I don't know. We spoke earlier on about entrance, something that you and I are very passionate about. We were speaking the other day about people coming into the industry, coming out of academia and coming into the industry. Have all the complications and confusions impacted upon, the journey of people coming into the sector? Do you feel that early career expectations have become quite unrealistic?
I think yes, and I think this is one area. I've been very careful not to be too critical of people doing this. Most of the time, the people I read on LinkedIn or I speak to in person have a similar view to me. In general, right? I'm not saying they agree with everything I say, but in general, data people feel like this. But there is one area where I think we could do better, right? And I think what you see in the world is you see the news media and universities and so on, putting big data-related developments on a pedestal. So your chat GPT, your self-driving cars, your, the metaverse, the Apple, goggle things that they've just released. These are big, sexy news stories that get attention, right? And what that then does is that new entrants to the market want to come in and work on all of this stuff, which is great. And don't get me wrong, you need a certain amount of selling, right? It's like when I was a kid, I always wanted to be an astronaut because it's a big thing, it's cool and it's exciting. But if you think about the space industry, there are millions of people employed doing more mundane things than the guy or girl who lands on the moon.
Yes.
Right? There's engineers, there's technicians, there's software developers, there's environmental people, there's geologists. They're doing interesting work supporting that mission, but they're not the people in the limelight. And I think the same thing happens here, where people that come into this industry want to be doing, I want to work on a neural network, I want to work on this. And if you think about the problem pyramid, most people are working at the bottom of that pyramid. Most organisations are not in that top 10%, right? They're working with table data. It's probably in a couple of SQL databases and some products, and they just need relatively simple things. I think the one area that we can do better as data people is we need to start talking about those low-level things, and we need to start celebrating them. How many conferences do you go to where somebody said, I built an Excel model for somebody in an afternoon?
You're right, mate.
And that, to me, that's the missing piece of the puzzle. Every time I go to a talk, it's always, we use satellite data to map something. And don't get me wrong, it's amazing.
Yeah.
But not everybody's doing that, and it can make people feel like a fraud or a failure if they're not doing that sexy stuff, And I think that's where us as data people need to open up more. I mentioned I've got a sort of idea that I'm going to try and do more of on LinkedIn, which is called small data stories, right? And it's basically just mundane stuff. I had a client the other day who wanted to do some data filtering in Excel, and because the data literacy is very, very low there, right? They didn't realise that Excel had data filters built in. They wanted me to go and build them a pivot table and a solution. Now, I could have charged them. I could have said, "Great, I'll go and do that," but I'm not really that kind of person, right? I'm not going to do that. So I just explained, well, you can do this in Excel. Does that make me a bad data professional, or does that make me a good data professional?
And I think a good human, which is
well, hopefully. But I think that's where we need to be having talks like that. That is a real life situation, that really happened. And these smaller wins, we need to be talking about them and telling the people coming in from universities that it's okay if you go into a small firm and you're the only data person there, and a lot of your life is working with Excel. We joke about that. You'll see jokes about that on LinkedIn about you build a fancy thing and somebody just wants to export it to Excel. So then, taking the principle of making data simple again, did you over-engineer that solution?
I think that's a brilliant point. And I'm thinking here about exorbitant fees that have been spent to fly in, for example, NASA people to come and speak at conferences.
Absolutely.
Where we should be heroing the people who are round about us, who are doing just as valid work, to your point, and probably keeping organisations going and keeping revenue and profit levels within smaller companies, because they're doing, as you say, making a pragmatic solution rather than, to your point, something that 90% of people could never aspire to, the higher echelons of, advanced data science and analytics. But, I think it's a very, very good point, and I look forward to hearing further more on this particular topic, mate. That's a cracker.
Yeah, hopefully I can get the time to put that together. But I'd like really something that it's something that we all contribute to, because I think if you go on LinkedIn and you get FOMO looking at people and what they're doing, it's hard to think, well, I'm actually part of this community. But the way you do it is you take the people that look like they're big hitters and you get them to sit down and say, do you know, here's some things I did that were not that exciting, but added value.
Yeah. Okay. Coming towards the end, but I think it's time, if you feel like it, to maybe point a finger or two. Is everybody to blame for this? Is it shared responsibility, collective guilt, if you like? The big tools vendors, data leaders, is everybody kind of in on this racket?
I think in this one, you know, I feel like lots of things in life, it's just a consequence of economic incentives, right? That's what's driving a lot of this, right? Yeah. What we all have to remember is, and not everybody's maybe aware of this, and I don't claim to be an economist, but, you know, since 2008, since the previous financial crisis to 2022, interest rates were extremely low. And so big venture capital firms were looking at, where do we put our money to make money? And they were willing to take more risks. And we saw lots of successes, Snapchat, WhatsApp, big companies, unicorns, so more than $1 billion valuation, getting bought up by bigger companies. Everybody wanted in on that racket. And this growth at all costs mentality, like, for example, Uber is a great example where they've never really made any money. I think they've maybe 1 or 2 quarters they've made a profit, and the rest of the time they're just burning through cash. But it's obviously because people are investing in self-driving capabilities and this future growth. And when interest rates are low and VCs have nowhere else to put their money, that is fine, and that'll survive for a certain length of time. But what it means is that if you are a small SaaS company and you take that money to grow, they're going to want you to grow. I think we need to start thinking a bit more about, and there's a bigger thing here about, you know, how people aspire to wealth and success. But there's some of these products where if they just built it slightly slower, didn't take a massive round of early investment, they could have a 2, 3, 4 million pounds a year revenue company, maybe making a high 6, low 7-figure profit every year. That's still a great viable business. You don't need to be getting to 400 million valuation to be a success. You can have a small business like that and run it, and that's still a great way of life. But I think we've kind of got in a lot of these companies have got in their head they need to be the next X, you know, or not literally X now that it's handy, but, you know, the next big company that's going to be bought out for $5 billion. And I think we need to get away from that mentality, and that drives a lot of the overcomplication because they need to oversell capability to get investment. Yep.
Aye, it's a kind of vicious circle. Aye, and you can't see it ending any time soon because who's going to be the first to step? To me, it's almost like a bit of a kind of nuclear arms race, and who's going to be the first to step back? You know? It looks as if it's going to harm. Okay, Colin, we're fast approaching the end, and we always end on 2 questions. The first one, I'm going to ask you to look forward into the future for a wee minute. We've come a long way as an industry in the last 20 years, and that's maybe not always been for the best. What progress in making data simple again do you see happening in the next 20 years? Is it just going to get worse? Can things be fixed?
I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. So I think, you know, whilst I've been somewhat critical of certain things here, I do think in general the data sector and technology is doing more good than bad in the world, right? And I think there are people out there who are trying to do their best and make things better. I think that interest rate change where now things are forcing VCs, obviously we saw a massive 2023 was a huge wake-up call for the whole tech sector, right? Lots of redundancies, lots of change in organisations. Obviously, you know, that was very sad. I was personally also affected by that last year, but it will change the market. I think people, as I mentioned earlier, opening up about the realities of small wins and about, you know, these small data stories, etc. I think that will help reorientate people. I think something I'd like to do more of, but just at the moment I'm really time poor to do it, is being able to go back into places like schools and help them educate children, younger children, on the benefits of this, what the reality is like as a data professional, get people interested in it. That, you know, the kids are the future of all of this stuff, especially when you're looking 20 years ahead. You know, that's the people that are in primary school now that are going to be shaping that market. And I think conferences and other places being more open to having maybe a track. You know, you'll go to these conferences, often there's 4 or 5 different tracks you can follow. One of them really should be about small stuff, the mundane realities of being a data person, because that's, as you correctly pointed out earlier in your pie chart analogy, that's where you spend 80% of your time. So we're having conferences about 20% of what people do, you know, and it's not the 80%, which is where people, and that disconnect doesn't help. And so I think things would become simpler if we were willing to acknowledge that things are oftentimes less exciting than we make out they are.
We always conclude each episode with a trip in the Wayback Machine. And if you could talk to the Colin of 10 or 20 years ago, based on what you now know about making data simple again, what would you say to yourself?
One of the things my wife always says, and it's one of my favourite quotes, is you have 2 ears and 1 mouth and you should use them in that proportion.
Wives are wise, dude. Wives are wise.
Yes, usually I'm getting told off for something. But I think being able to listen to people and actually really dial into what they want, you know, because that is driving a lot of this. Going back to the disconnect and the lack of data literacy, if a data leader, if a business leader is coming with a requirement, you actually have to untangle that sometimes and tell them, you don't really want that. You actually want this. And I think that influencing piece where you're able to actually change their mind a little bit is really important. The other thing I would say to people, and it drives a lot of what I'm talking about this kind of small data stories idea, is don't get FOMO on social media of what people are doing. Right? That just life in general, right?
Yeah. But
also in this world. You know, I saw a great article. There's a lady, Megan Liu, I think her name is. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, who put a post up on LinkedIn. She's quite a famous kind of data influencer, who posted that actually she wasn't really doing stuff that was exciting as it made out on her thing. And she's got 100,000 plus followers. And it was brilliant. And it really opened my eyes to, you know, this was maybe 6 months ago.
Right. This
concept of actually people aren't doing as exciting stuff as maybe it might first appear. Yeah. And I think the other thing I would say about this, the final point, is the basics are never going to go out of fashion. So there'll be a hype cycle for LLMs. There'll be a hype cycle for some fancy new model technology, whatever. But being able to data model, being able to use SQL, being able to understand statistics, being able to communicate, being able to do these basic things, those things are never going to go out of fashion. So if you're coming into the industry or you're feeling a bit lost, focus on those basic things, because there's always demand and value in those.
What a note to end it on, sir. Now,
thank you.
You've spoken about this little mission that you've got about talking to the world and letting them know that simple things can be beautiful things. If somebody wanted to communicate with you in a wee bit more detail on this, Colin, what's the best way of getting a hold of you? How would somebody reach out and get some Colin Parry?
Best place to get me is on LinkedIn. So if you search for me or you search for my company, Head for Data, you'll see the branding on LinkedIn and myself on there. I'm working on getting a website made, but I don't quite have that yet. But that'll come hopefully soon.
You will see your great wee robot cartoons that you put out regularly. We can just agree on by Chrome. They are some good cartoons.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Colin, thank you so much again for taking the time to speak to me today. Thanks for sharing your passion, your knowledge and your expertise on making data simple again. I hope you, dear listener, have enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. And if you have, please take a moment to review the show on your podcast or video platform of choice, giving us 5 stars, obviously, and share this episode with anyone you feel would benefit from a view or a listen. Thank you. Please do look out for the other episodes in this podcast series where I'm joined by other special guests discussing topics relevant to today's bosses and data. Visit mbnsolutions.com for resources like our UK data salary survey, to watch recordings of our latest data meetups, or to download our white papers, research and thought leadership. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter for the latest news, views, opinions, and of course, hottest opportunities in the data space. Goodbye.